What you are looking at is not 5 separate charts. It is one structure, observed at 5 different scales. And that distinction is extremely important, because the purpose of this analysis is not to compare historical events. It is to compare proportions. The technology is different. The monetary system is different. The participants are different. The speed of information is different. The absolute price is different. And yet, across approximately 155 years of S&P 500 price action, the same geometric language appears again and again. Expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction, and expansion again. So let's move through the structure one image at a time. Image 1, the 155-year time structure. The first image is the largest scale. This is the S&P 500 compressed into a 12-month representation across roughly 155 years, beginning in 1871. At this scale, individual candles become almost irrelevant. What matters is the architecture of the movement. The structure can be interpreted as 5 major waves. Wave 1, Wave 2, Wave 3, Wave 4, and Wave 5. But what is really being measured here is not only price. It is time. Look at the horizontal measurements. We have approximately 26-year intervals. We have 52 years. We have 58 years. We have a 61-year Fibonacci measurement. We have 100 years. And we have the larger 138-year Fibonacci relationship. These measurements are important because they are being treated as absolute temporal distances. The market does not care whether the period occurred during an industrial economy or a digital economy. A year is still a year. A decade is still a decade. And therefore time can be used as an independent coordinate system. Now look at the first major structure. From the initial condition around 1871, the market advances toward the major peak associated with the 1929 period. That first large expansion forms the basis of Wave 1. Then the structure contracts. The movement around 1937 and the post-war period becomes the next phase. Then the market begins a much larger expansion. This eventually develops into Wave 3. The important feature is not that the market repeats the same events. It doesn't. 1929 is not 2000. 1937 is not 2009. The economic mechanisms are completely different. But the distances in time between major structural transitions can still be compared. That is where the fractal idea begins. The 26-year intervals are particularly interesting. They act almost like temporal building blocks. One interval, then another, then combinations of those intervals. 26 becomes 52, and larger temporal relationships emerge from the same units. This is not saying that the market has a clock inside it. It is saying that when a chaotic system is viewed over a sufficiently large scale, recurring ratios of duration can become visible. The same idea appears throughout the rest of this analysis. Now notice the larger structural landmarks. The Great Depression, the post-war transition, the 1971 monetary regime change, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 to 2009 reset, and the current Wave 5. The external environment changed dramatically at every one of these points. But the geometry is being evaluated independently of the narrative. That is the key. The news explains the event. The geometry measures the structure. The 100-year measurement is also important. It takes us from the 19th century initial condition toward the 1971 monetary transition. And then the larger 138-year Fibonacci measurement carries the framework even further toward the modern regime. This creates a hierarchy of temporal scales. Small intervals, medium intervals, large intervals, and then the complete cycle. That is already a fractal concept. And then we reach wave 5. The current large-scale expansion begins after the 2009 structural low. The analysis projects the next temporal interval forward, approximately 26 years. Not because 26 is a magical number, but because 26 has already appeared as a structural temporal unit inside the larger system. This is how the model is using time, not as a prediction mechanism by itself, but as a proportional coordinate. Image 2. The same structure through price geometry. Now we remove most of the historical annotation, and something very different becomes visible. This chart is using the same 155-year structure, but now the emphasis is on price geometry. The price axis is logarithmic. That matters enormously, because the market is not a linear system. The distance between 10 and 20 is not the same type of movement as the distance between 5,000 and 10,000. In absolute dollars, they are completely different. In multiplicative terms, they are the same. Both are a two-fold expansion. So when we compare wave 1 with wave 5, we should not ask whether the number of points is identical. That would be the wrong geometry. We ask whether the proportional expansion is comparable. This is where the Elliott wave concept of wave 5 relating to wave 1 becomes useful. Wave 5 does not need to reproduce wave 1 candle by candle. It does not need to travel the same number of points. It does not even need to occupy exactly the same number of years. The meaningful comparison is structural. Wave 1 is one large expansion inside the entire 5-wave system. Wave 5 is another large expansion inside that same system. So wave 1 becomes a reference scale for wave 5. The question becomes, can wave 5 reach a comparable geometric role when measured in relative rather than absolute terms? That is a very different statement from saying that history repeats. Now notice the Fibonacci grids. The earlier structure is surrounded by a proportional price field, and the current wave 5 structure is surrounded by another proportional field. The fascinating thing is that once the price axis is viewed multiplicatively, the two structures begin to resemble each other much more clearly. This is another level of fractality. The first image was measuring time. This image is measuring price. The structure, therefore, has at least two independent dimensions: temporal proportion and price proportion. And now the important observation. The market is not just moving from one price to another. It is moving through a sequence of proportional states: compression, expansion, retracement, re-expansion, and extension. Those states appear inside the first wave. They appear inside the third wave. They appear inside the fifth wave. And that is precisely what makes the structure fractal. Image 3. The next resolution. Now we move down one level. The 155-year structure disappears. We are now looking at the market from approximately 1987 onward. The frequency has increased. The time window is smaller. And because the window is smaller, the internal movements become visible. Look at the overall rhythm. The 1987 region creates a major reset. Then comes the 1990s expansion. Then the contraction into the dot-com period. Then another major contraction into 2008 to 2009. And after that, another prolonged expansion. This is the same grammar we observed on the century scale chart. Only now the frequency is higher. This is one of the most important concepts in the entire analysis. When we zoom in, the pattern does not become a completely different object. It becomes a higher frequency version of the same type of object. The scale changes. The amplitude changes. The duration changes. But the sequence of expansion and contraction remains recognizable. That is what I mean by fractal. Not visual duplication. Structural repetition. Notice the horizontal normalized field. The structure is being represented between 0 and 1. This effectively removes the absolute price scale. We are no longer asking whether the market was at 500, 1,500, 5,000, or 7,000. We are asking where the price is inside its own normalized range. That allows very different historical periods to be compared using the same coordinate system. And once you do that, the internal rhythm becomes much easier to see. Now look at the major contractions. The dot-com decline, the 2008 to 2009 decline, and the later corrections. Each contraction interrupts the expansion, but does not necessarily destroy the larger structure. Instead, the contraction becomes part of the next subdivision. That is exactly how a nested fractal behaves. A large wave contains smaller waves, and those smaller waves contain even smaller movements. Image 4. The current fractal at daily scale. Now we move from decades to the current market. This is the daily structure from approximately late 2024 through 2026. And now the entire 155-year architecture has been compressed into a much smaller object. But look at what remains. A range, a breakout, a correction, another expansion, a new range, another breakout. The geometry has become faster, but the grammar has not disappeared. The Fibonacci field now becomes much more precise. The lower reference is 0. Then come 0.236, 0.382, 0.5, 0.618, 0.786, and 1.0. These levels divide the current structure into proportional regions. The important point is not that price must reverse at every Fibonacci number. The important point is that Fibonacci gives us a coordinate system for measuring the expansion of the current wave. Notice the large range around the 1.0 level. Price spends significant time interacting with this boundary. It moves above it, returns toward it, tests it, and eventually separates from it. Once price moves beyond 1.0, we are no longer dealing with the original range. We are dealing with an extension of that range. And this brings us directly into the next image. Image 5, the final zoom. Now we zoom into the newest part of the structure. This is the highest frequency layer of the entire sequence. Everything that came before is now compressed into a small number of months. And here the geometry becomes extremely clean. The 1.0 level represents the previous structural boundary. Price breaks through it. Acceleration begins. And the current movement reaches approximately the 1.236 extension. That is where price is now interacting with the next proportional boundary. Above that boundary we have further extensions. 1.382, 1.5, 1.618. These are not promises about future price. They are geometric continuation points. They tell us how the current structure would scale if the expansion continues. And this is exactly where the fractal idea becomes useful. The same proportional language that was used to describe a 155-year structure is now being used to describe a movement lasting months. Think about the compression that has occurred. Image 1. 155 years. Image 2. The same 155-year structure expressed through price geometry. Image 3. Roughly 4 decades. Image 4. Roughly 2 years. Image 5. A few months. Time is shrinking. Frequency is increasing. But the analytical language remains the same. That is the fractal hierarchy. And this is also why the historical analogy must be handled carefully. The argument is not 2026 is going to become 1929. That would be far too simplistic. The argument is 1929 and 2026 can occupy analogous positions inside a larger proportional structure, even though the world producing those movements is completely different. That is a much more interesting hypothesis. A chaotic system does not have to repeat its exact trajectory to preserve structure. Small differences can produce different paths. But the relationships between expansion and contraction, the relationships between one scale and another, and the relationships between duration and amplitude can remain statistically or geometrically persistent. That is the type of order we are searching for. And this is why Fibonacci matters here. Not because Fibonacci is a magic prediction tool, but because ratios give us a language for scale. A price ratio, a time ratio, a wave ratio, a duration ratio. Once those ratios are applied at multiple resolutions, we can begin to study the market as a nested system. So the 5 images are not 5 different analyses. They are 5 resolutions of the same analysis. The first image asks, what is the architecture of 155 years? The second asks, can that architecture also be expressed through proportional price geometry? The third asks, does the same structure survive when we increase the frequency and look at the modern era? The fourth asks, does the same proportional logic exist inside the current market? And the fifth asks, does the current movement itself contain another subdivision of the same geometry? That is the core idea. The market changes its technology. It changes its institutions. It changes its monetary system. It changes its participants. It changes its speed. And it changes its absolute price by orders of magnitude. But the system may still preserve relationships between time, price, amplitude, expansion, contraction, and frequency. The 1.236 test. And this is where the current structure becomes especially interesting. 1.236 is not a random extension. It can be read as 0.618 moves. 0.618 plus 0.618 is equal to 1.236. So geometrically, it can represent an extension of the 1.0 structure by another Fibonacci unit. That raises an important possibility. Could 1.236 be a large-scale spring test, potentially the final test of Wave 5? We don't know yet. But as long as the S&P does not close a monthly candle above 1.236, the possibility remains that this zone is not a new breakout, but a distribution test at the scale of the entire 155-year structure. Too early to call. But it is absolutely on the table.